Hello, thank you for joining me here at Bert's Books. Welcome to 2025, and not something along the usual lines today. I'm going to be talking about an e-book rather than a physical book, so I can't hold one up and brandish it at you, but this is one that you might say I've had some creative involvement in, perhaps on the editorial side, you might say, and I've got to give it a plug. You've got to give a mate a plug anyway. It's one of those, yeah, but he's a mate sort of things. A very obsessive one. So we are going to be talking about the new ebook title, which claims to be non-fiction, Withdrawn Condemned, a childhood of punk rock music and railway enthusiasm by an artist known as Hugh Gadget, up now on Kobo Books. And this is billed as a title concerning the push and pull of childhood fixations during the punk rock era. And I suppose broadly it deals with the conflict in parentally sanctioned childhood interests, in this case train spotting and railway enthusiasm, and the more under-the-counter sort of forbidden fruits that presented themselves here in the form of punk rock music, which at the time was viewed by many adults and teachers, etc., as a rather taboo, controversial thing, particularly around Jubilee year. So, I suppose many of us go through this as kids. It probably still happens when you're happily ticking along. You've got your childhood fixations and obsessions, and that's seemingly no problem. They're sort of parentally stamped, if you like, and then something catches your eye when you get to a certain age, and you're at that age where you're kind of questioning the view of the world that parents or teachers are sort of trying to hold up, and finding yourself excited by other influences. And I suppose in this case there's this kind of glorious period of unself-consciousness on the cusp of a time of life we'll call adolescence, when you can gleefully just indulge in both. You haven't figured out what's hip and what's unhip yet, or not quite. And for a spell, the artist involved was sort of happily seeking out punk rock records and this sort of thing, and at the same time going off to places like Eastleigh, train spotting, going on these kind of excursions that, I suppose by the time you're 14 or so, you get all 13, 14, you get kind of a bit self-conscious about those sorts of things, and you start thinking, I'm never going to meet girls. If it's like, is Joe Strummer a railway enthusiast? I think not. I don't think anyone quite appreciated at the time that I think Captain Sensible was. And as the intro to the book points out, Joe Strummer ended up having a diesel, Class 47, I think it was. He had a diesel named after him shortly after he died. Class 47, I forget the number of it now, but that circle sort of closed. But I think for many of us there's that adolescent thing of, all right, what's the thing I'm supposed to embrace here? You sort of form a inner picture of, I suppose at the time you're seeing pictures of the Clash and the Ruts and people like that popping up, and you sort of get this idea of yourself, I want to be an urban gorilla in strappy black trousers with zips and Doc Martin boots and a leather jacket and spiked up hair and whatnot, and spray painted logos and all this. Your mum's still buying your clothes at that point in life, and you're still playing with a Hornby train set. So it's kind of amusingly absurd, but it sort of provides a window on the time that is hardly the textbook perspective of punk rock. But I think the other slightly unique feature about it is that, for most people, if you were very lucky, you were part of the circle, or you were close to the action, and all very exciting. But for a lot of people, they can, as the Clash put it, in the faraway towns, trying to figure out a roadmap to this thing and what it was and who these people were that were making these exciting records. And when you're that sort of age, it's a bit unclear whether you're allowed to go to gigs at that point. I mean, certainly not in certain clubs, the city clubs. I mean, a lot of this takes place around Portsmouth, incidentally. So, we both had adolescence around there. So, there was the Guildhall, where I think actually you could get in places like that before you were drinking age. That was, to this day, I don't know what their lower bar would have been on putting gigs on, but I do remember them putting Musical Youth on there, so it might have been quite low. I didn't go to that one, incidentally. Kind of wish I had now. But when you're 12, 13 and at school, you don't know, and also your parents aren't necessarily going to let you go out in Pompey that late at night. You're scrabbling around. If you're lucky, you've got an older brother or sister, and they're coming home with music papers and this kind of thing. And then you're limited to, at the time it was 3 TV channels. The main music program was Top of the Pops, which it's not like it banned punk rock, but it did ban certain records, and you kind of had to sit there filtering through a lot of the other stuff, trying to get to the stuff you were interested in. So it's that sort of perspective on it, sort of being, I suppose, quite gauche and unhip, and trying to figure out your way to this sort of goal of hipness, and which ultimately is quite, hipness isn't what, it's such a nebulous thing, hipness. When you get to my sort of age, you just kind of, who cares, well, once you're into your 30s, I suppose, well, it was with me, you started that, well, you don't need to be self-conscious, your interest is just your interest. I've reverted to, I'm going to do an episode on this one day, I've reverted to tropical fish, right, which is real throwback stuff. I was doing that at 12, very unsuccessfully at the time, but somehow in recent years I've just kind of, what have I got to be hip for? I'm gonna revert to what might be perceived as real nerdy, or as the Japanese say, otaku stuff. But it's nice to be able to embrace it, and I think this book captures that. It's very idiosyncratic. It's like I say, it's really not a textbook treatise. It doesn't have, if I'm going to pull criticism here, it doesn't have that level of detail that like a full focused rail enthusiast would want. It's not going to tell you on which day which class 37 went through that. It's not going to tell you that sort of detail, but then again, we are talking nerdiness, so there is a certain amount of, as much obsessive detail as can be reconstructed reasonably at this distance. So the trivia, it's not like, again, a lot of people had that classic roadmap into, when they were very young, they were sort of into the glam and Bowie and stuff like that, and then there were these crossover bands, and if you were hip enough, you kind of rode that, you recognised where the winds were blowing, and the transition from glam into punk, with this kind of period in between of, I suppose, bridging bands like the Doctors of Madness or the heavy metal kids, who incidentally do get a mention in here, or pub rock or whatever. But when you're a little kid in your sort of polyester anorak, you don't really have a very structured roadmap like that. But however, the author was lucky enough to have been in front of the telly. His dad was watching Panorama at the time, on the now quite notorious episode where the heavy metal kids show up on that. Now, if you don't know about the heavy metal kids, they're now classed as fairly essential kind of pre-punk in the British music scene. They were sort of loosely of that glam era, but they were kind of quite rough-hewn for all that. They were, and they were fronted by Gary Holton, who later on became a household name as an actor, most notably through Auf Wiedersehen Pet. But in the 70s, he was this kind of bother boy, yob rocker, or the kind of, what's the expression? The dandified hooligan sort of character. So, if you're a little kid at quite a tender age, I think he was 8 years old when this showed up on the telly. The shock value of that, almost equal to if you'd seen the Bill Grundy show that suddenly pop up at the time. It was that, the world is not as my teachers and my parents and so on would want you to think. There's this other thing going on, there's this other level, and it's kind of, it's scary and it's worrying, but it's kind of exciting, and you can't help looking, you want to see more of this somehow. And you get those instincts, while you still crave approval from parents and so on, you still have this contrary instinct that only grows more intense as you reach your teens, that you want the under the counter stuff, you want that grubby, taboo, nasty stuff that your mum doesn't want you to get hold of, kind of thing. And this ran too. Also another interesting trivia point in there is that it deals with part of the if we're going to call it the revolution at the time. Punk was arguably foreshadowed by a sea change in boys' comic books. And if you were reading boys' comics at the time, you know, your standard thing would have been your kind of Warlord or your Battle or your Valiant or whatever, which was, I mean, I suppose slightly graphic war stories maybe, but it wasn't giving you any sort of message that your granddad wouldn't have wanted. You know, it was all kind of traditional British daring do kind of thing. It was either kind of stiff upper lip officers or plucky salt of the earth sergeants and corporals giving them a taste of the cold steel and all this sort of thing. But all this was just tipped on its head in 1976 by a publication called Action, in which there is some detail. The author was an avid reader of Action, as you'll find if you read this, and he went through that thing of having, something's coming to the newsagents that it's not on the top shelf, but no one's looking closely enough to realise that it's full of things that your parents wouldn't want you reading. There's this kind of Jaws. A lot of the stories were kind of riffs on sort of current big blockbuster type thing, so there was this kind of pseudo Jaws in it called Hookjaw. Extraordinarily graphic. I mean, to have been 9 years old and suddenly you're going to the newsagents and coming back with something which is showing a shark biting people's legs off, you know, in really graphic detail. And, you know, I mean, another of the popular things at the time that it riffed on was, in those days, I mean, we have touched on this in the channel, the popularity of these kind of pulpy war novels like your Sven Hassels and your Leo Kesslers. Action kind of tapped into that with its war story turned the cliches on its head. It gave it a German war hero in the helmet of the Hammer Force, which was, of course, controversial at the time, although they kind of trod this moral line in it by having constantly at odds with National Socialist functionaries and so on. He's the kind of decent professional soldier kind of archetype who he will do his job but he will have no truck with fat slimy Nazi toads, as the blurb went. So that, you know, there was that. There was a riff on rollerball. It was outrageous at the time, and this actually was, I mean, I think it was just before, or very slightly before, Punk started making the big headlines. I think Action got pulled from the shelves around about the autumn of that year when they did a Yob story. And again, I think this probably fed from things we have spoken about on the channel, the kind of New English Library type Yob novel, the Richard Allen, the one that was written under a pseudonym by the guy who wrote Confessions. I know I did something about it a couple of years ago. Soccer Thug or Soccer Hooligan. It riffed on those kind of novels with a strip called Kids Rule OK. And that was the end. I mean, the football yob was one of these 70s social bugbears. It was an archetype that there was a lot of tabloid anxiety or you know, shit staring about, and a lot of parental anxiety and so on. So Action just flirted with that, and it got its fingers burnt so badly. It got yanked off the shelves, I think just before the Sex Pistols' first single came out, or around that time. So there was this kind of odd foreshadowing of punk, or you could tell there was something in the wind even without hearing Punk records. So there's a lot about there's just, as you would expect from a train spotter, a whole load of obsessive trivia, but I suppose that's a lot of the charm, really. So yeah, I wouldn't say, it's probably not going to strictly qualify as steampunk, it's probably not going to qualify as diesel punk, but it probably is, as to my knowledge, the first Railway Enthusiasm punk rock crossover memoir, certainly that I'm aware of. I mean, who else would write something like that? I don't know, Gadget. Well, also, if you're at all, I know there's a certain amount of historical or nostalgic kind of interest in Portsmouth punk rock kind of environment. We're talking a perspective that's kind of too young to have really been part of it. There's some interesting kind of memories of the kind of style wars that were sort of acted out in the shopping precincts and so on around that area at the time, and the joys of trying to sort of stay up late enough to listen to John Peel and, these kind of things. The journey from reading your older sister's teen mags, which, Jackie and things were, to be fair, covering punk to some extent, but then your evolution through that, suddenly Smash Hits is available, and that's kind of an accessible way in before you graduate to the kind of full, we're going to say, adult music mags, of which there were 4 at the time. There were 4 broadsheet music papers around that time. As people forget, there was Record Mirror was one of those, and then Zigzag, towards the end of that. So yeah, if you're at that point in life where you're prepared to embrace your inner nerd, and that sounds like the thing for you, I would recommend you give it a go. $3.99. I say I have had some editorial input into it. If you spot any typos, you work with what you got. It's punk rock. So anyway, first and only time I've plugged an ebook, but there you go. So well done, Gadget. Good effort. And I'll get back to sort of more regular subjects next time. Thank you again. See you very soon.